Fidelity presentations, bringing focus to the importance of standards, reference materials, training, and education to biomedical science. We are honored today to have Rick Arthur from GE share his perspectives on the importance of modeling in science. I will say that Rick asked me to keep his intro modest, but when I looked at what his bio was, it was a big challenge. So I'm going to read through some of the things that he shared in his bio. So Rick is a senior principal engineer for GE Research, Digital Technologies. He's focusing on advanced computational methods research and its application to digital engineering. This involves pathfinding of novel computing hardware and software architectures and connecting these with the industrial application opportunities. Rick has over 30 years experience with GE, supporting products and services that span diverse industrial sectors, ranging from healthcare to energy. And there's a lot of things in between that I cut out to make things shorter. Rick established the Advanced Computing Laboratory to build expertise and facilitate adoption of emerging hardware and software capabilities critical to GE competitive advantage in materials manufacturing, e-commerce, controls, and automation. And things that we really pay attention to are security, information services, medical diagnostics, and life sciences. Beyond GE, he has worked with DARPA, NBC, Universal, Lockheed Martin, and the Department of Energy's national labs. Rick received his BS in computer engineering from Clarkson University, master's in engineering and computer systems engineering from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, and an MBA from the University at Albany. He has made a point to serve the professional technical community in roles distinct from GE interests. He is a co-chair of the U.S. Council of Competitiveness Advanced Computing Roundtable, technical member of the Exascale Computing Project Industrial Council, and has advised on working groups for the National Science Foundation, Office of Science and Technology Policy, universities creating programs in computational methods, and companies leading the state-of-the-art in software and computing hardware. He previously worked on the Science and Engineering Technical Advisory Council for the Blue Water Supercomputer at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications, which is in Illinois. And Rick co-chairs the AIAA Digital Engineering Integration Committee's Digital Systems Model Working Group. He is a senior member of the Association of Computing Machinery. Last note is Rick frequently posts and shares independent insights and perspectives on platforms such as LinkedIn and Medium. And the title of today's seminar is The Imperative of Modeling in Contemporary Science and Engineering. So welcome, Rick.
All right. Thank you, Eric. And thank you for inviting me to speak on a topic where I have a lot of passion, and just make sure we're still hearing me okay. Good. All right. So this topic is really central in a variety of contexts, including economic competitiveness for high-tech industry, national security, and the forefront of science and engineering policy. So I've adapted what I'm presenting today from prior talks, including material from the Computational Approaches to Cancer workshop, the Exascale Computing Project, and the Air Force Digital Campaign. I understand this webinar may be recorded, and I'll work with Eric and Kelly to have the visuals available as well, because I'm going to run through some of the visuals pretty quickly. There are links and references throughout the material, which when you get a PDF of it, you can follow up for yourself. So given the context of this audience, I want to acknowledge the great work, vision, and inspiration of people like Eric Stolberg and Emily Greenspan, and with that, my own awareness of some of the dangers around the word model for this community. So right up front as a caveat, I want to state my appreciation that what my mind thinks of models may require some clarification relative to the biomedical research community. I found this 1985 reference that was quoted in this document, which seems to have a reasonable start. A biomedical model is a surrogate for a human being or human biologic system that can be used to understand X. So in terms of the goals of models, the distinction may not be as far distant. In particular, I want to also credit another visionary that it's been a pleasure to work with, Dr. Tina Morrison, who's now director of the Office of Regulatory Science and Innovation at the FDA. She was a driving force behind advancing the FDA's engagement with digital evidence and in silico modeling way ahead of other regulatory agencies. And important recognition being that while so-called in silico modeling is imperfect, this is also true of the traditional alternatives like animal models, clinical trials, etc. So let's land on this definition to get started. The consortia in COSI and NAFEMS, and COSI is the International Council of Systems Engineering, NAFEMS, National Agency for Finite Element Methods and Standards, drive a lot of forums and discussions around these topics, and the definition here seems workable. We're looking for something that will abstract something we want to study so that we can better understand it, make better decisions, look at scenarios to understand some of the boundaries, and ultimately to have predictive capabilities. I've recently been working through a book that was published in the last year called Framers, and in that it's provided some clarifying ideas around the concept of models, which they in particular call framing. And it's a little bit of a hopeful look at the importance of human beings and our minds in the context of so much that's been happening lately, saying how machine learning and AI is going to substitute that. So they observe that success is not about the decision point, but about shaping the choices from which you can decide. And that we do this through mental models that are constructed through our skill in causal reasoning, building counterfactuals, which are like short imaginings of future possibilities, and then applying or lifting constraints around the use of that model or frame. And that success is really about your skill with which you can create and collect and improve the frames that you apply in whatever you're trying to do. And they point out science in particular, because of the explicitness of applying frames, it's a real lead user in the expertise here. They also point out that when we hear about, oh, the AI machine just beat humans at they often gloss over some of the underlying aspects that were not uniquely discovered or created through the AI process, including that AlphaZero kinds of things that Google has shown, but that in fact there are constraints and underlying rules for the environment that are expressed. And these are important to recognize that these are not likely areas that the AI techniques are going to be pulling from us. So I'll revisit this at the end in full clarity, but the gist here is the context that we're in is there has been this long exponential that if you do an exponential long enough, it starts looking like a step function. And this is what Moore's law did for the abundance and affordability of computing and storage. So all of the technology there allowed us to store even more stuff, sense more stuff. And we had this data deluge, which really the effective way of addressing was automation and machine learning, which then kind of created some of its own problems. We can start looking at data as a precious resource necessary for the conduct of science, engineering, business, etc. But we have to be vigilant against garbage in, garbage out. So data quality becomes an issue. Reproducibility and collaboration become a potential challenge. So we need to attend to interoperability for data exchange and such. And then all of this is making all of our systems and systems of systems more complex. So the VUCA world idea, we have machine-paced volatility, potential uncertainty, amplified complexity, and potential ambiguity, including things like intellectual debt, which I'll talk to later. So having framed the context, let's step back and get to the simple. So an essence of competition for businesses like GE is in highly technical markets is creating this problem-solving engine. We want to reliably, consistently, powerfully, opportunistically innovate and solve problems of the business. Ultimately, these technical problems are posed by business stakeholders, often engineers, who then advise on the solutions back to the business, including adaptations of current or entirely new products and services. But it's not really an engine. There are people involved here. So the problems are conceived in the minds of people and solved by the minds of people applying the scientific method over, at minimum, mental models to inquire, test, and learn toward informed understanding. So we use models in everything we do. So this we just have to take as a given. If you're making a sandwich, deciding which way to drive to work, how to cool a machine from thermal stress, we can only achieve these through the use of at least a mental model. And if we externalize these models, we can then also collaborate on those solutions. But this requires that we share specific detail in that externalization so that we can agree upon some of the assumptions that we make and the specificity of the subject. The same applies, of course, to the decision maker, being explicit and specific in the problem statement and what the problem solver then communicates back, including trade-offs to consider between alternatives, dependencies, risks, unknowns, assumptions made, and opportunities to address any of those unknown factors to mitigate concerns that may have an impact on confidence, understanding, or overall performance. So of course, realizing that the competitive value of problem-solving R&D, the decision makers, business executives have granted these scientists a laboratory and equipment to better perform their science and problem solving. And we use that infrastructure then to go beyond the Socratic method, Newton's method, theoretical, and perform experimentation. Simulation offers an additional paradigm evolving out of these advances in computing. And offensively, competitively, it means faster time to design things, perform product upgrades, and assess the opportunities for new breakthroughs like better battery technology. Defensively, it can reduce the costs in physical experimentation, including waste such as consumables, energy, rig setup, prototypes, parts, and we're able to replace or reduce these physical studies with virtual studies by way of disciplined virtual analysis. But when you are performing these things in a virtualized model, especially if your products are, as noted here, highly complex, high value assets, safety critical, with consequential downtime and long field life, these are not the kinds of things you want to risk to the so-called garbage in, garbage out, where your model is not going to accurately reflect reality. Therefore, the linkage between the model and empirical physical tests is critical for verifying the calibration and validity. So besides rig tests, another form of verification and validation that we may do is backhaul field data from digital twins, so instrumented deployed products, to further calibrate and validate the predictive accuracy of these models. So aligning with conventional experimentation and infrastructure, this sustained explosion in computing capabilities has fundamentally altered the underlying infrastructure that supports what's the state of the art of practice in science and engineering. So let's look more deeply into that forefront of modeling and simulation. This happens to be a visual, it's also the one on my background, of jet exhaust. And this provided highly accurate noise prediction compared to measured testing. Modeling and simulation is something that GE has well ingrained into several of the product lines, and this drives a really insatiable hunger for a underlying practice and infrastructure, to the point of thinking of these kinds of models as essential scientific instruments, the way we would think of a microscope or a telescope in studying the microscopic or the cosmic. Now, beyond that, we can also consider and address problems that have no viable physical alternative but computational modeling. The 96 Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty is what put the Department of Energy and the NNSA on the path to really what has been decades leading work in modeling and simulation because of the prohibited physical experimentation. In climate, we really have only one biosphere on which we can experiment, and there are prohibitive costs and risks associated with that. In astrophysics, we cannot conduct experiments such as supernovas. The ITER reactor is something that the whole world has had to collaborate on due to the expense, and physical prototypes of the full reactor would be impossible, so there's a necessity for the modeling. Epidemics and toxicity, and this is long before, I had this for long before recent times, ethical limitations to experimentation are a factor. And then unobservability. This one is a GE gas turbine, and some of the phenomena of interest that we would like to measure, we would be challenged relative to the resolution, the temperature ranges, having measurements interfere with the system that we're trying to understand. So in that sense, the computational model has some distinct advantages. So there are pragmatic limitations to purely empirical studies. Difficult to measure, expensive, impossible, unethical, impractical, prohibited. And in this wide range of activities has driven the practice and implementation of the applications that have been able to harness these expanding capabilities in computing. So we have abundant and affordable storage, network, and computing. And as that more and more awesome hardware is unleashed, the software systems on top of it can take advantage of that increased performance and scalability to implement more sophisticated systems and improve numerical robustness of the models and simulations. Those increased software capabilities then lead to increasingly relevant and clever applications by which we can then implement our mental models into digital systems, taking the computer as really an extension of our mind or a collaborator, if we anthropomorphize it, in improving our models through hypothesis generation, testing, validation, communicating between experts, and workflow, productivity, and integration. So compounding all of the above, model-based physics converge on greater and greater realism as we are able to integrate more models, reduce previously necessary simplifications, and gain additional predictive fidelity. Fred Streitz from Livermore, now with AITO, Department of Energy, used this slide that I always found just such a stark illustration of how the advances from 1980 to 2011 in terms of our home computers improved from the blocky Pac-Man kind of graphics to rendering cloth and smoke and flames, and it is literally more realistic. And in Livermore's case, right up to the real-time beating heart with 150 micron mesh resolution, multi-system simulation. This is a very stark illustration of the opportunities for realism as we take advantage of greater and greater computing capability. Now, in my world, this is what it looks like, where on the left is the methods that we previously had before we could computationally run a higher fidelity model of turbulence, which you see on the right side, which is tremendously more valuable to the designers making decisions or understanding the underlying factors. So countering the garbage in, garbage out for numerical models, we need trust in model results and that linkage to empirical physical measurement to confirm and assert predictive accuracy. A number of groups from ASME, INCOSE, NAFEMS, and other organizations that that were mentioned in here have built together consortia on formalisms to help bound confidence and disciplines of practice for these. So we take all these elements together: accuracy, confidence, realism, flexibility, sustainability, productivity, scalability, robustness, and these become key criteria in an effective infrastructure to support that model-based problem solving. So if we want to understand the capabilities of that infrastructure and then put forward a path that can allow us to ever improve it. We need a way of measuring and benchmarking against the potential entitlements there. So this framework is built on 3 sections. One, trying to address the model's competency that you're employing. So numerical stability and robustness, the realism, how much is it simplified, the confidence, can you bound the uncertainties, and then accuracy, how well does it match or predict the physical test. An architecture that is scalable and able to take advantage of the ever increasing innovations in computing technology, but also interoperable and flexible with everybody else who is contributing to that work. And then last, the software engineering and computational methods so that your users will be productive. So this is like user experience and automation opportunities, workflow, and sustainability. The keeping up with modern standards, practices, and methods along the way. And in the spider web chart there, you would assess and then plot and then set goals to do this. In the article that I wrote talking to this, I cite a number of grounding tools that can be used where extremely deep thought has gone into it. For example, obviously India National Labs, the PCMM, or Predictive Capability Maturity Model, looks at a number of these dimensions around the verification, validation, and uncertainty quantification of the model implementations. Of course, the model-based enterprise also relies on people with the needed knowledge and skills. So the decision-making executives in the business, as well as the scientists and engineers that are performing the technical problem solving. That is being able to correctly, precisely pose the questions and then communicate back those answers. So again, this means skill in being explicit and specific in transferring what is in your head in a mental model to somebody else, and to have those teams be able to share amongst themselves. So in another separate talk is it's a walkthrough of this digital literacy rubric that I had developed in conjunction with our digital team and human resources, thinking about not only what you would want to have in a new hire, entry-level skills around digital literacy or modeling literacy or computational literacy, but also up to the decision makers and the people who are setting the roadmap. There's a tool called 4 Stages that goes from a learn phase to a do phase once you are productive, to a guide phase where just realized I had those up, to a guide phase where you are the decision maker or producing the work for the do team, and then the shapers being the most mature. Now, that may not be a cycle that you go through just once. Every time you take on a new position, you may start again with learn and progress through the steps. So the list here tries to outline what those necessary skills would be to be productive. And in my experience, the executive decision makers have as much or more work ahead of them to improve their literacy and proficiency as the entry level. All right, so let's talk about types of models. I always love the George Box quote, all models are wrong, but some are useful. So a model could be purely derived from data. The ones shown on the left are orange dots for the pickup locations and blue dots for the drop-off, or maybe the opposite of taxis in New York City. So just driven by sampling data. In the middle, we have a simulation of a combustor. So this is applying rules as best understood in our description of the physics. And then on the right is just how much does postage cost? So those are arbitrarily defined rules that you can follow. So all of these represent models. And one of the things that has entered very necessarily into the whole modeling discourse, of course, is machine learning. This quote from Jeff Bezos is perhaps one of the clearest, in my opinion, ways of stating this. This was in a letter to shareholders, where he describes what is important about machine learning. He says, over the past decades, computers have broadly automated tasks that programmers could describe with clear rules and algorithms. Modern machine learning techniques allow us to do the same for tasks where describing the precise rules is much harder. So let's go back to the wrong and useful part. When we have the clear rules and algorithms, it's wrong in the sense of we're expressing our best approximation of what we understand. It's useful in that we can extrapolate outside of direct experience and generalize and reapply, assuming that those same rules are applicable. In machine learning, which are data-derived models, they're useful where describing the precise rules is difficult, but they're wrong through numerous potential sources of limitations and liabilities arising from things like bad data, missing data, or sampling the wrong region for applying it, inability to explain, or the ultimate result of the black box that we create, which again, I'll visit later. So as we go through building a model for a product, and then we manufacture the product, and then it goes into operation, if we embed sensors into that product and kind of co-launch with it a model that is introspective of that sensed data from itself or the environment, that is a digital twin. And this was part of the panel that was at the Computational Approaches for Cancer last year. And so I pulled in some of the concepts here because they're directly applicable. So we have a lot of, GE has a lot of products that are sufficiently high cost that it's worth having these kinds of sophisticated models co-launch with them. Jet engines, power plants, and high-end medical imaging equipment. So keeping them up and running, so no downtime, and ever improving them is a significant part of the investment. And in understanding the machine health through that process. There we go. Okay. So we take the inputs, understand the state of the machine health, try to predict a trajectory for that, and then apply this through maintenance or different operational controls to keep these things running reliably. This is something where there may be opportunities in healthcare to apply something similar. Ironically, we may take care of our machines in a superior way to humans, if only because we can better instrument them and sample their state, and they may have a much more finite set of state and systems. There are some very interesting parallels between thinking about biomedical contexts and these machine contexts, including how a digital twin of a patient or of a tumor or of a disease pathway is potentially able to leverage this digital twin concept. And also that even as a machine or a part is a component of a larger machine or a fleet of machines, we have that same kind of abstraction from the proteomics up to cells, up to tissues, to systems, organisms, and populations. So there are many common themes that these can each draw upon. So in our definition of digital twins, when we think about them, these are models that are calibrated to a unique instance, so like a serial number rather than a model number. They have some kind of value in decision making or the actions that you take. They're adaptable, so you're not making a custom one for every single instance, and also thus scalable across a fleet of products, or in the case of slide for cancer care, across a population. So these would be used to do things like learn from the past of the individual, understand the present in the context of other things that may be going on, looking at a expected state and understanding the gap between that prediction and actual, so that we can employ this to better guide how we are applying therapies or which diagnostics to prescribe. So we would, in theory, create a personal baseline for each patient, the collection of those becoming a population norm. Then we begin to monitor various things within that patient, look at the gap of what is measured versus what is expected based upon population or historic norms for the patient, to determine what the next diagnostics or treatments should be applied. And this allowing us to move toward this idea of managed wellness rather than a responsive treatment to, when it basically gets to be too late. So the diagram below, which I had pulled from a slide that Gina Terrassi had used at Oak Ridge, this is looking at that slope of degenerating into a severe medical undesirable state, and being able to understand where those gradients are and steer away from them through these practices. So going back to the points then that I wanted to emphasize in terms of the importance of modeling in the practice of contemporary science and engineering. we have this technological step change from Moore's law, which gave us this abundance and affordability of the storage and processing. This creates a massive amount of data. So then necessarily we had to add machine learning and automation techniques in there to tame this. But then the data become this precious resource. So we got to curate the data and make sure that they are right. But it also can mean that people become protective of that data and consider it a competitive advantage. So this and other aspects of this lead to these challenges: the garbage in, garbage out concern around accuracy and completeness, and ability to state confidence bounds around the models that are employing data. Reproducibility, the so-called fair data, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, that promotes collaboration and allows us to check the results of claims from others. Standards, so that we have increased interoperability between my model and your model, as well as the ability to exchange data between them. This ever-increasing VUCA world, due to network effects of all of these factors running at faster and faster speeds, and the potential non-transparency elements in the machine learning, and then the importance of understanding the provenance, the pedigree of the data and what went into certain decisions that were being made along the way. So looking at some of the key pieces in these challenges. So automation and machine learning are essential to tame the data deluge, as we mentioned. And I would assert that this collaboration between machines and people, while it does create a challenge, it is a potent solution for many of the issues. These machines are superior to people in terms of continual and repetitive tasks, consistency from task to task, executing things concurrently. We think we can multitask, but that's a way we trick ourselves. Complex interpretation. So I say beyond human perception. So being able to pull patterns out of 7-dimensional data sets, for example. And then rapid and very fine-grained control. And this is something in things like cybersecurity is becoming so necessary. You can't run things on human scales. And one of the supercomputing keynotes laid it out this way that I thought was astute, that the machines have perfect memory, they can do massive computation, recognize very complex patterns and the math and complex statistics, while humans still have the subject matter expertise, the ability to direct the goals for the system. This goes back to those being able to do counterfactuals and constraints. Our common sense, or our sense making and causal recognition, and then value judgments about and this again is kind of a constraint, what can actually be acted upon and it's applicable. Intellectual debt, I've mentioned several times. What this picture on the left shows is a great illustration of what is traditionally called technical debt. So this is where you just keep adding and adding and adding to a system, and to the point of saying, you know, we'll go take care of this down the road, and that's the debt. You know, eventually I'm going to have to come back here and put in the real system, but for now I don't have the time or the money, so we're just going to, you know, slap another thing on it. And a lot of software or application infrastructures end up having this accrue over time until somebody has to pay the technical debt and re-architect or install a new system. Intellectual debt corresponds to this by way of us taking our machine learning models and using them in ways that are in fact useful. In the article, they give the example that we used aspirin for hundreds of years without understanding why it worked, but we didn't care because it worked. And then eventually we had to find out more about how it worked if we wanted to understand if there were scenarios where it wouldn't work or how to improve it. And this is something that is going to arise out of the use of machine learning, not only in terms of individual black boxes we may create through these data-derived models, but as we connect black box to black box to black box, and we have a multiplicative lack of understanding. Even if they're working, we will not necessarily know what we don't know or how to improve it. Again, in contemporary science and engineering, in order to have these models interoperate and exchange data in a coherent way, we will want the FAIR principles to apply. So the data should be findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable. Technically, they've added another one, which is open, so that you also have the rights to use it, so that we can do things like reproduce scientific claims, but also so we are able to perform the validation, verification, and confidence bounding on these models that may be going into critical systems. And these are key components of the model maturity framework that I touched on earlier in the slide. Additionally, in terms of standards and open frameworks, this is where the systems engineering community has invested tremendous thought and the development of tools. So there's systems modeling language, SysML, FMI, the functional mockup interface, and then efforts coming out of places like NASA and DARPA, like OpenMBE, MDAO, and OpenMeta, which are linked here and can be structured for a follow-up. Then the last thing in the list I had given, the knowledge stewardship, something that I've bundled into this idea of the awakened enterprise. There's what's intended to be a 3-part series of articles. The first 2 are out, and unfortunately the third one, which is kind of the other shoe dropping, has been on hold as I've been trying to find collaborators to assist in it. The idea here is that ultimately what is of value in these processes is determined at the point of decision making. And this could be even in not just product design, but in patient treatment. So when you are at that point of, I'm going to order this test, or we're going to try this therapy, you have in your mind some assumptions and known unknowns, or some limited set of information that provides the context for making that decision. In the future, those assumptions may be refuted, the unknowns may become known, and the data may be different, and you would have made a different decision. But we don't really have that luxury, or what I call this continuum mindset, where we can in a disciplined way, revisit that decision. Yet the technology is moving in this direction where we could actually monitor fresh publications or new technologies that come out, new materials, new drugs, and what's coming back from instrumentation and sensors, and have it actually alert us if we make our decisions in a way where we record those assumptions, unknowns, criteria, etc., to say, hey, you should go back and look at this again because this new insight shows that a critical assumption you made is wrong. Or could even say your assumption is right, in which case you may take another action. This is one of the opportunities we have in taking strengths of a machine and the strengths of a human and combining them together into what is addressed in the machine augmented mindfulness, where if we can express our decision making or our critical assumptions, the unknowns that we are seeking, there are powerful ways that using the persistence of a machine to monitor new developments, do pattern matching, and then have perfect memory can allow us to systematize how we do decision making and support us in important ways that complement some of our own deficits as just being human. Okay, so again, so the data as a strategic asset is one of the key takeaways. This ability of being able to assess the current state of maturity and practice and look for the opportunities then to virtualize or pilot some new approaches that may become feasible with advances in the computational infrastructure, that you can suddenly do things out of Fidelity that you couldn't before, have data to things you didn't have access to before, and then reduce these to practice, being able to automate, virtualize, leverage standards, share out that to progress things. Data has become absolutely central to all of this. This idea of systemic mindfulness and knowledge stewardship, having the underlying infrastructure that you can leverage to get the computational capability, the sufficient capacity of storage for the data, the users then being at least literate, if not fluent, in the practice of modeling and digital technologies. So there's a workforce development component, but there's also an executive decision maker competency in building the confidence in them to invest in and promote and incorporate these kinds of approaches into the practice. And then human-machine collaboration so that we can look at the complementary strengths of what these computational systems can do and what humans can do, and bring those together. So these are mentioned throughout the talk and our additional potential follow-on explorations. And that is the material I covered, and I just squeaked in under. So thank you for listening, and as I understand, we'll have some discussions now.
All right. Thank you, Rick. Kelly, how are we doing for time? All right, let's just jump in with any questions that people may have. So, not seeing any questions and no one's coming off mute yet.
I have one
Go ahead.
question. There was a very interesting slide that you had on digital literacy for the future of engineers. There was a knowledge and skills, and obviously went through that, looked at it there we go. I was curious, where does that come from? Because this is a huge amount of very interesting and very useful information. I was just curious where that was developed or how it was developed.
So I developed this in conjunction with human resources manager that was in our Silicon Valley facility, and then I refined it over the years. It's also the product of having led the workforce development team for the Council on Competitiveness Advanced Computing Roundtable, where we were trying to understand the deficit in skills to use modeling and simulation in government agencies, industry, etc. This is being used currently to advise the direction of an internal training course at GE called the Analytics Engineering Program. I've also shared this with the Air Force Research Lab, and am hopeful that there may be some further conversations there as they are on the path to trying to better educate the people across the Air Force in this digital transformation.
And Richard, that's very interesting because I am one of their strategy consultants, so I am working with them. So when you say that, that makes my heart very full in a good way.
Well, we should definitely follow up. So I've
Yeah.
been talking with Pam Coburn
Yes.
about this, and I think one of the desirable outcomes is now taking this rubric and being able to connect dots between these desired outcomes and actual training courses that may exist, or if there is a gap to either extend an existing course or to work with some training facility to build those out. Because I think the common goal here is that you can go to some existing training authority or source and receive this kind of training. I do not believe this exists anywhere today.
I agree. I mean, we have not seen it elsewhere, even in other commercial as well. So that's why I was curious. It just seemed like very well thought out, and give you a lot of credit. So thank you, and pleased that you've been sharing it with Pam and their team. That's great.
Other questions? So Rick, just to jump in and open things up a little bit in some different areas. What do you see the role of national labs being in helping move models forward in biomedicine? And I'll say computational models in this case.
Yeah, and the work that has been done under the DOE NCI collaborations between Gina Tarasi, Rick Stevens, Fred Streitz, and such. I think it has powerfully leveraged the DOE's experience in building models from complex and difficult to make realistic and bound confidence around problems. So the strength there, along with the subject matter expertise in NCI, that is an excellent basis. The the frustrating thing about biomedicine for me has always been that it seems to be the most opposite you can get from digital, because there's no crisp ones and zeros. It's all, oh, what's the relative salinity of these two things, and there's all these hidden mechanisms and factors, and we didn't record this one condition that this experiment was done under, so we don't know if that was an influencing factor. So this lack of a deterministic ground truth is kind of a confounding element to the application. So it's good that the DOE has these matured practices, frameworks, and math applications, libraries, and such to at least have that part of the problem largely solved, so that you can begin to address that on these other levels. The biology, going to the to this picture, has a wonderful what we would call multi-scale opportunity. And as I know at GE, we've tried to look at neurodegenerative, cardiovascular kinds of diagnostics and treatment evaluation, being able to shift between these levels of abstraction, as indicated in the lower column, like understanding, say, what our cellular model would then translate into the tissue model, and how the tissue model would translate into the overall systems model. Those are some significant challenges that I think are important for us to solve, and can also help the DOE as they look at similar issues with materials. For example, going from an atomic model to a molecular model to a crystal structure to the macro properties of something. So that practice, and that's even, we've only been talking about spatial scales. Going to the temporal scale adds yet another dimension, right, where your cellular model may run at time steps of microseconds, and the organism one is running at seconds. And so integrating those is an additional challenge. So I think mainly it's that knowledge and that infrastructure that you can harvest from all the work that they've done in energy sciences and stockpile stewardship.
Okay. I think we have another question. Len, did you have a question?
Yeah, sort of a question comment, really kind of based on what you were just starting to touch on. And actually, this was the slide that sort of spurred my my comment question. When you talk about, standards and reproducibility, which is the focus of our working group, I do think that, automation and machine learning, as you mentioned, introduce an important level of, as you put it, consistency, et cetera, that ultimately at some, to a certain extent will increase reproducibility, even in the biology realm. And in fact, several years ago in San Francisco, my former organization, the Global Biological Standards Institute, we actually held a meeting on that very topic, which was really actually turned out to be really interesting. But I guess the point / question I was going to make is that, you can only take it in biology and in medicine, you can only take it so far, because, as this slide you've got posted here kind of alludes to, the human organ is, and ultimately cell is, there are just so many variables that come into play as opposed to a jet engine or a combustor or a fuel nozzle, that my head starts to spin and ultimately explode when I keep reducing it down to that point. And so I guess that's the comment. The question is, how far do you think, machine learning, artificial intelligence can take this at the cellular/molecular level?
So, and it doesn't have to be AI/ML. And actually, Aaron, this goes back to a conversation I had with Pam. One of the potential powerful computer science techniques that may have some promise here is agent-based systems combined with the idea of digital twins. So the idea is you may be able to make a model of something that you created and you can see all of the inside workings of. But in industry, we may want to do, say, competitive reverse engineering of somebody else's product. So we're not starting with their blueprints and how it works. Or in the military, it may be an enemy equipment or system or forces. But you can start with a template and define the interactions and the observables between that template and the things that you can structure as a known model, and then kind of play it through with historic data, or you can kind of, the term in cybersecurity be fuzzing. You could then run it with perturbed potential data to understand what are some of the tipping points or bounds. And the idea ultimately is taking an emulator model that is very coarse and inaccurate at first, but as you play it through more and more feedback iterations, it will converge on something closer and closer to the correct behavior within the system into which you have deployed it. So this is clearly limited by the computation and storage and data that you can access for this, and having that kind of granularity of data for all of the cells in a tissue is prohibitive today. But as we innovate on ways of doing sensing, as we gain more and more access to abundant and affordable computing and storage, there may be ways of kind of doing this, what we would in imaging call iterative refinement, right? So you have the first bad guess and you just keep trying to pull out the error.
Right. I mean, that's kind of what we're doing with Atom. Eric, maybe you want to describe it, Atom, to Richard. And we are using supercomputers with Livermore, but it's at, it's at a small, it's at a chemical level right now. But go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, and Len, I was just gonna follow that up, but also for those that are hanging on, we'll switch to the roundtable format for the discussion in just a moment. I mean, it's been going pretty well. But yeah, Len, you're right. Adam is really looking at, as we do the active learning, as we come up with the hypothesis that certain molecules will behave a particular way given the models that we have, and then go test those in the laboratory. We update the models, and that's essentially confirming what Rick was saying is a learning feedback loop where you incorporate additional observables into your model to improve the model to account for those observables. And it's given the complexity of biology, we don't have the benefit of some first principles equations that we can start from at the level that we're working to observe and influence biology. I mean, obviously at the lowest level we can argue that there's physics and chemistry first principles, but the complexity quickly grows to such a level that the mathematical determinism is lost. Right? So we have to go to a new level of observation, and well, we know underneath that there's probably a truth of something that we could use. We just don't have the capacity to do that necessarily as we would in other areas. But it still is a foundation that we know is there that can help drive the directions of the models and things that we do build. So,
And going through some of the, if we formalize the identification of assumptions and unknowns, then those can also drive the guide the prioritization and exploration of research to fill in what are the most critical blanks along the way. So the models don't only have to embody what we know, but what we don't know.
okay. All right, thank you. I think we'll move into the roundtable mode. Rick,